Hello. I want to talk to you about a combination of two topics. And this is the topic of responsible technology and how we can be more conscious of the technology that we build, and then how that intersects with the ilities. And so, let's get started. We'll see if this is going to work. There we go. So I want to start with a couple of stories. Many years ago, in, of all places, Calgary, Canada, I was giving a talk to a local group that was really more on the operations side. So you had CIOs, operations managers, and we were having a discussion about systems. And I made the assertion that not all systems need to be 5 nines of reliability. And I had this person come up to me afterwards and say, "How dare you? You're a professional. How can you ever say that not all systems should have 5 nines of availability?" And I said, if you really believe that, you're either wasting your own time or you're wasting your employer or client's money, because it takes an awful lot of money to get 5 nines of reliability, and there are a lot of systems that don't need it. One of my standard examples when I'm trying to explain to people why there is no such thing as a good as the ideal architecture for everything. I worked in central London for a while. They had a sandwich ordering system. It kept no PII whatsoever unless you consider the fact that the person sitting in that particular desk every single day ordered an egg and cress sandwich on wheat bread. That's the closest thing to PII that they had. And come on, it's central London. If the system is down, I walk down a flight of stairs, and within a few block radius, there are dozens of places that I can get something to eat. There is nothing mission critical about the sandwich ordering system. It does not need 5 nines. Even if it's unavailable for an entire day, I'm not going to starve. But there's a very different system that I also worked on when I was in Uganda on sabbatical. And this is a system called Rapid FTR. And FTR stands for Family Tracing and Reunification. And this was a system that we helped UNICEF build. And part of their responsibility when there's war and famine or natural disasters is to help bring families back together. Because when people are fleeing, families often get separated. And how they used to do it in the analog world is they would take pictures of the kids. And this is particularly relevant when the kids are, 3 to 7 in age. And they would take pictures, but there would be multiple camps in the same area, and it was quite possible that the parents were in a different camp. And so they had to figure out, how to find what this little girl, who she belongs to, when she probably knows her name, although she might be too terrified to talk. She probably thinks her parents' names are mom and dad in whatever language she speaks. She probably can't give an address. How are they going to reunite this little girl? Now, when it's in the analog world, you can protect information. Because if somebody wandered into the camp and tried to say, "Hey, that's my little girl," they wouldn't have enough information about the little girl, because all they would put on the board was the picture. Now you put this online. The idea is all of the different camps upload all of their pictures and all of the information, and then they can try to match up. Well, mom and dad in this camp over here say they're missing a little girl who's 5 years old, and there's a little girl who's 5 years old who kind of matches the descriptions so they can show the pictures. But what happens if somebody breaks into that database? Now you're setting that little 5-year-old girl up to potentially be trafficked, because that database has all the information this person needs to come into the camp and say, "That's my little girl." And sure, she's going to be traumatized, and she might scream. The kind of protection that we needed to give to that database is worlds away from what the sandwich ordering system needs. Now, let's talk about another story, assuming I can get, okay. There we go. This is a story of inadvertent, irresponsible technology. And this actually isn't high tech by any means. Again, while I was in Uganda, I was talking to a representative from an NGO. And he was telling me a story about somebody at a different NGO. Now, this might be, I'm asking for a friend, but he said it was a different NGO. And they had gone to this village, and in this village, the well was a mile out of town. And the women would have to walk every day 1 mile to the well and 1 mile back to get water for their family. And the people in this NGO had the brilliant idea, we're going to build a pipe from the well into the middle of the village, and they did. And then they started noticing that it was getting sabotaged. And so they'd fix it, and then it got sabotaged again. And they thought, maybe we better figure out what's going on here. Fortunately, they sent in, effectively, an anthropologist. And what they discovered was the cultural norm within the village is that the women were not allowed to socialize unless they were walking to the well and back. And so by bringing this pipe in, they had taken away all social interaction from the women in the village. It was the women who were sabotaging the pipe because they lost all connection outside of their family unit as soon as they put that pipe in. But the NGO, they weren't trying to hurt the women. They were trying to help. They just didn't understand the situation that they were in. And that's a common problem for us technologists. So is technology inherently good, inherently evil, neutral? You could find people who believe lots of different places on that spectrum. And I'm sure most of you would be primarily on the good end of the spectrum, not necessarily thinking that it's the solution to all of our problems or never causes any problems whatsoever. I love this quote from William Gibson. I think technology is morally neutral until we apply them. It is only when we use them that for good or evil that they become good or evil. And this pretty well reflects how I think about things. But what it doesn't talk about is, as technologists, what are our responsibilities around this? And is there a way to make it harder for people to take our technology and use it for evil purposes? So how really do we know? We do call them unintended consequences for a reason. That NGO did not set out to isolate the women of that village. That was not their intention whatsoever. They just missed the reality. But if you look across many of the technological innovations that have happened, particularly those that interact with the public, we suffer consistently from unintended consequences. Actually, we suffer inconsistently because very often the unintended consequences happen to the people who have the most to lose and who are more vulnerable. And so this is a problem that we have to take into account. As technologists, are we taking into account people other than the ones that we intend to help? So why are we talking about this now? Well, the first thing is the world is more and more interconnected. Our systems are more and more complex. And so it becomes much harder to predict what's going to happen. It was hard before, how something might change the dynamic, how putting in a particular incentive might cause an entire cascade of behaviors that we didn't even anticipate. But it's become more complicated just because of the global scale and the interconnectedness. The impacts are also greater. I remember several years ago, many years ago, I came home from work and got my mail, and I had 2 pieces of mail, which clearly came from marketers. And the first one was a catalog for items for a mother, a new mother with a small child. The other piece was a solicitation from the American Association for Retired Persons asking me if I wanted to join. Now, at that time, I was in my early 30s, and I had no children, and I was nowhere close to retirement age. What was the consequences of that? Some trees died. I just took them and threw those pieces of paper away. As we start to look at where systems are being applied now, credit decisions are being made. Criminal justice decisions are being made. Medical suggestions are being made. And of course, the people who are presenting the products to market will say, but there's a human in the loop. This is a recommendation to a judge on whether or not to grant this person probation. I don't know how it is in Denmark or in your country, but in the US, many judges are elected. And so judges are going to be loath to overrule a recommendation from a system that is touted as so wonderfully perfect at predicting who is going to reoffend, which is a notoriously difficult thing to predict. And so even if the person is in the loop, there are other incentives that might push that person. I don't know that I agree with that, but I'm not sure I'm confident enough in that. And then, of course, there's this little matter called generative AI. When you start to think about how generative AI is being used, we have to figure out how, as technologists, we can do a better job of predicting what's going to happen with our technology when we put it out in the wild. One aspect of that is clearly keep a human in the loop, but that is probably necessary, at least for the time being, but it's certainly not sufficient. So what is responsible tech? What is this thing I'm talking about? The idea here is to try to take into account not just the people that we're focusing on. We're problem solvers. As technologists, I see a problem right there. Okay, now I'm looking at that problem and figuring out what I'm going to do with that problem. And there might be people over there, but I'm looking at the problem. We need to take an active consideration of the values, the potential for unintended consequences and negative impacts. And importantly, we need to make sure that we include a wide variety of voices in not only adoption, but also deployment, and in fact, creation. And we want to try to manage the risk and the potential harm to all communities affected by the technology. So part of this is we need to make sure that we include all those externalities in the analysis. Externality, for those of you who are not familiar with this term, is often used in economics. And it's those things that aren't directly related to the cost of doing business, like pollution, like destruction of land as a result of, say, a strip mine. We need to include all of these things in the analyses because even if it doesn't affect our bottom line, it is going to affect people. Now, I had a problem with this definition because it's not just all doom and gloom. If I start to look around and say, you know, if I tweak my product in this way, I can expand to this new market. I suddenly have an opportunity that I didn't have before. One of the examples I use here, there is a very well-respected pacemaker that is simply too big to fit in most women's bodies. And when the device manufacturer was asked about it, they said, that's okay. We're happy with the market that we have. But they did have a potential to expand their market, double it, by simply making it smaller. Now, of course, they'd have to completely re-engineer it, and I'm sure they had internal discussions about should we spend our development and research funds trying to figure out how to make this thing smaller or address this different market over here. But the fact is, this is not all, make sure you don't do anything bad to people. It's also, make sure you're taking advantage of the opportunities that you have available to you. So I want to talk about a few, I'm calling them principles here, but it's more almost food for thought as you're starting to tackle these problems. So let's start with, first you need to focus on the outcome and who should benefit. But as you think about who should benefit, think about, am I being inclusive enough about who could potentially benefit? And when you're talking about the outcome, try to not just think of the first order effect of the outcome, but what might be the second order effects of the outcome, the third order effects of the outcome. This is really hard for us. Don't assume no one is going to misuse what you give them. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg set out to start a genocide in some far-flung country. What he didn't do is think about the way his technology could be used, exploiting the algorithms that he was trying to create to do something he had no intention of ever doing before. We're very bad at thinking about how people are going to do this wrong or how people are going to use this for evil. I happen to know I don't have the kind of hacking mentality. When I was a systems administrator, I sought out the person who was the best at it and said, I will give you full system privileges. Just tell me where my system's vulnerable, and if you misuse it, by the way, you get fired. And he did. He came to me with things I never would have known about that I needed to close in the system. He had that mindset. I did not. I still don't. Look around you for the stakeholders that you haven't paid attention to. As I said, we're problem solvers. This particular group of people has a problem. What about all these other people? We need to lift our head up a little bit and look around and say, how might this affect the people who live in the place where this mineral is being mined? How might this impact someone from a different cultural background or a different religious background? We need to think about the people who might be harmed that we haven't even thought about. And this is an interesting one. Sometimes we have to decide whether we want to maximize shareholder value or whether we want to be fair. I listened to a talk and then a Q&A that Kathy O'Neill, the author of The Weapons of Math Destruction, gave at Google. And from one of the questions she was asked, she basically made that same statement. Sometimes you have to decide if you want to be fair or if you want to make money. And the specific example that she used, in the United States, it is illegal to make things like credit decisions on the basis of race. But it isn't all that hard to find proxy values that approximate, give a good indication of somebody's race. Should you use it or not? It depends. Some organizations would say you should use it because that might improve your bottom line by lessening your default rate. Others might say, no, we are not following the spirit of the law. That's an organizational discussion that has to take place. But unfortunately, as technologists, we are really bad at these things. We want to solve the problem. We don't want to be told all the reasons why we might do something different. And in fact, we're probably in a worse position than most people to say what might go wrong, how this might be misused, because we're so focused on how it's going to solve the problem we're trying to solve. So how do we sell the value internally? One of the times I've given a talk on this subject, somebody raised their hand and they said, no business is ever going to agree to do this. Why would we waste time doing all of this? Well, Thoughtworks did a study of executives across many different countries and asked them questions about responsible tech. And one of the questions they asked was, do you think responsible tech is important, and if so, why? I was really excited when I looked at the headline number of the percentage of executives who thought it was important. What was their top reason? Compliance. Because somebody else was telling them they had to worry about this. In the EU, you've got GDPR, and the fines are such that it isn't something that you can just ignore. That's part of the problem with some of these approaches we have to dealing with externalities. If you look at the cost to a company to not dump waste on the African continent, and you compare that to the fine, it's fiscally irresponsible of the company to decide to not dump the waste. Because the cost to the company, if they even manage to get fined, is significantly less than the cost it takes to properly dispose of the waste. Okay, so that's why you have rules, so that those kinds of decisions can't be made. This one is definitely coming more into play. Protection of the brand from reputational harm. The hit Target took. The hit that CrowdStrike took. All of these different organizations suffered significant reputational damage. Now, unfortunately, it didn't take long for it to dissipate. Oh, well, yeah. Stock price went down for a few weeks, but all's okay now. But the flip side of it is that, particularly depending on who your target audience is for your organization, your customers viewing your organization as having a set of values that they are willing to work towards and defend can actually enhance the opinion of your brand. This is becoming more and more important as we get the changeover in the workforce. Gen Z in particular care a whole lot more about are the actions of a company aligned with their stated values and with my values. And so you can enhance your employer brand by caring about this stuff. You can increase market opportunity. Go back to that pacemaker. They made a choice not to do it, but if they had chosen to do it, they just doubled their potential target market. Increased investor interest. This is ebbing and flowing, shall we say, but ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance, ESG-style investing is a thing. And despite the pressure that is on it in various places, it's still a thing. And so you can actually enhance your stock price if you were viewed as being aware of the environmental and social consequences of the technology decisions that you make. So I like to consider myself a tech pragmatist. As a developer, as an architect, as a technologist, what are the things that you can actually do? The first thing is you've got to start a conversation within your organization. As I said, you might have to make the decision, how much of this data are you willing to use to the advantage of the organization before you feel like you've gone too far in what your customers might be comfortable with. I'm on a particular mailing list, and there's all kinds of discussion at the moment about the fact that LinkedIn added an option about using your data to train their internal AI. The problem is you had to actively opt out, and it was a very quiet announcement, and that's got a lot of people up in arms. What should your organization do? Now, this isn't as easy as it sounds. I was talking with a chief data officer at a bank in Australia, and she had joined all excited about wanting to put in a decision framework for what they would and wouldn't do with their customers' data. And she figured it would take 3 to 6 months. I saw her after 8 months, and she said, I'm really hoping we're going to be done in the next 3 to 6 months. This stuff is hard because, yes, as a profit-making enterprise, you're responsible for figuring out how to make money. You also have customers who have particular expectations. Our CMO once said to me, no one minds being tracked if the recommendations are good enough. And I said, well, that statement is patently false because I can point you to individuals. They don't care how good the recommendations would be. They don't want to be tracked. But the point is there are a lot of people who are very comfortable with that. And the discussion that is playing out on this list, which is effectively comprised of CTOs and other technology leaders, there are some people in the no way I'm going to let them do that, and they immediately opted out, and it's like, well, wait a minute. I want them to recommend things to me. I'm there for this reason. So it's not cut and dry what the right choice is. That being said, data protection and privacy is something that we all have to be aware of. I live in the Seattle area, and a few weeks ago, an incident occurred where the entire airport for a while was completely shut down because of a cyber attack, which they determined was not terrorist in nature, but completely disruptive. I still haven't heard the after-action report on how exactly they got in. But as these things happen, more and more people get impacted, and more people get frustrated. And that's when you get to this next point, which is you need to invest in transparency. The worst thing that you can do is lie to the public about what went wrong. There's all kinds of debates with respect to CrowdStrike on whether or not they're being transparent enough. But invest in transparency so that your customers know what to expect of you and that your investors know what to expect of you and they can see what you're doing if something does go wrong. Specifically around data analytics and AI, you want to investigate and audit for bias in your data. One of the speakers earlier, I think it might have been Kevlin, mentioned the fact that these things are trained on what happened in the past. And sometimes this is a result of discriminatory systems, but sometimes it's not. One of my favorite examples of this is there was a teaching hospital in the US, and they were trying to develop an AI model that would recommend to them whether or not a particular patient needed to go into the intensive care unit after a particular procedure. And say that they loaded all of the records. They used 2 different training algorithms. One resulted in a model that was very difficult to interrogate in terms of what it was actually looking at. And the other, it was relatively easy to look at what were the factors that were being taken into account. And they noticed that no mention of the condition asthma was ever made. That's because they sent all of their asthmatic patients immediately into the ICU, and so there was no decision making there. But they had left all of those out of the training set. The people developing that model were not discriminating against people with asthma. They didn't think about what their data set looked like. And we're developing more and more capability to both interrogate data sets, but also in the realm of explainability, so that you can have an understanding of what was the basis of this decision? What were the factors that were taken into account, and how did that influence the decision? Some more. Observability. We need to be able to understand what actually happened. And without the right kind of observability, you can't know what was the path this thing flowed through in the system, and how did we end up in the situation that we just did. Minimize your environmental impact. We are looking more and more about how are we using resources effectively. One of the examples earlier in the week was the zombie cleanup of instances that were running overnight. Now, that particular example, they included the fact that it had a bug in it, and so it was wiping out the good stuff as well. But the point is, we need to be conscious of the resources that we are using. And this is, fortunately, also a cost implication, but has significant implication for the environment. Diversify the workforce. One of the times I gave a talk on responsible tech, one guy raised his hand and he said, "This is just a talk about diversity." I said, "No, it's not. There is no way, if you were going to have a unified product vision, that you could get representation from all of the different possible stakeholders, let alone taking into account externality." So it's certainly helped by diversity, because somebody might say, hey, have you thought of? But diversity is not just the answer. But if you do have a more diverse workforce, you're more likely to have somebody who says, wait a minute, if you make this tweak, then we got a new market over here. Isn't that great? And worrying about accessibility and inclusive design. And there's some real low-hanging fruit here in the way that we develop systems. One of my colleagues has put together an article that lists you could fix 90% or 85% or some ridiculously high percentage of your accessibility problems by looking at these 5 things. 5 things isn't a high bar to open your products up to a significantly broader community. And so how do you actually do this? One of the things Thoughtworks did a few years ago is we went out and tried to find all of the different techniques that people were using to try to think differently. My personal favorite, just because of the name if nothing else, is the tarot cards of tech. And it literally is a deck that has personas. One of the personas is the evil actor. And it prompts the discussion. Let's brainstorm how people could use this wrong, how they could use this for mischief or for evil. Another one is, who are the forgotten? Who haven't you thought about? What stakeholder group? And again, it's a prompt for a conversation and tries to get you focused on a particular aspect of what you might have missed. Because we're really good at solving the problem we're trying to solve. We're not necessarily good at not causing follow-on problems. So I want to talk a little bit about how the ilities interact with this notion of responsible tech. Let's start with our favorite AI. Bias, and thus the data sets. Do we really understand enough about the systems that underlie the creation of our data so that we can understand what kinds of biases might come into the decision making, and therefore, what are we going to do about it? One of the classic examples of this is facial recognition. And previously, many of these facial recognition models were trained on the people in the legislatures of Western countries. So you got lots of white men, some white women, and then you start, it's that power law distribution again. And then you've got the long tail of all the other people. And a woman named Joy, who formed the Algorithmic Justice League, which I think is a great name, said, gee, well, first she went to the 3 major model vendors and presented her results. She was focusing on how poorly it did at the recognition of black women. And IBM gave her the time of day. They allowed her to speak to their researchers, and they delved into her findings. The other people kind of ignored her. But what she did is she went back, and the only thing that she did is add to the data set the photographs of people from the legislatures in Asia and Africa. And the recognition rate for people in that long tail skyrocketed. Shocking. If you actually have data about what an Indian man looks like, you might be able to recognize someone as an Indian man. This stuff isn't always that obvious. But we need to really think about, where did that data come from? Obviously, copyright and fair use. There's all kinds of discussions going on. If Copilot gives a snippet, how big does it have to be before you might get into trouble with the person who owned the code in the first place? Non-determinism. I don't know how many of you in this room were lucky enough to have the conversation with a chief operating officer or a chief financial officer and explain why eventual consistency wasn't so bad. They have a mental model of how technology behaves. You put something in a database and it's there. And if you read it immediately, it's going to be there, and it's going to be what you just put in there. Not quite. It'll get there, don't worry. And don't worry, we won't use this eventual consistency on your bank balance. Having that conversation was hard enough. Another part of their mental model is if you ask a computer a question, it will give you an answer. And if it's in the same state and you ask it the same question, it will give you the same answer. Not with AI. Part of its power comes from the fact that it's inherently non-deterministic. Explaining that to a COO is even harder in some ways than explaining eventual consistency, because you can carve out this area. Oh, we won't ever worry about that. But any place they deploy this AI system, they have to deal with the fact that it's non-deterministic, let alone hallucinations. My favorite hallucination, one of my colleagues collected from the group of our technologists a list of the technology stacks, and he'd been doing this for about 5 years. And he loaded that all into an LLM and asked the question, what was the most popular technology stack in the year 2022? The answer he got back was a short story. The closing paragraph of the short story shows the level of creativity, actually, in these LLMs. I am not a farmer planting a field. I'm an arborist nurturing a tree that will live 100 years and contain a village. That was the most popular technology stack in the year 2022. I will assert, though, that hallucinations in many ways are a feature, not a bug. Think about what we ask these large language models to do. Write me a short story in the style of William Faulkner about this particular event. How in the world can it do that if it doesn't make stuff up? The story doesn't exist. It has to make stuff up. So part of our job as technologists is to figure out how to convince it, no, don't be in that creative mode. Be in this other mode. Right. Resource utilization. This came up on the panel last night. The number of data centers that are being projected just to train these models are enormous. And yes, you're going to hear, oh, but we'll use renewables. When you're using that much power, it's conceivable that that means that you'll accelerate the deployment of renewable resources. But until that expansion of the renewables happens, it doesn't matter if you're using renewables, because all the people who would have used those renewables are probably using dirty energy. So we have to pay attention to the resource utilization. What are some other things? I mentioned this before, but as an architectural characteristic, accessibility and inclusive design can be considered low-hanging fruit. There are well-known approaches and well-known tests that we can put into our systems to determine if our system is inclusive or not. Data privacy and protection. Think back to that UNICEF system. I was actually involved in a project with the United Nations on specializing this notion of responsible tech to their environment. Accessibility was one of their important factors, but this was their single most important factor, because the kinds of people the UN deals with are in crisis and they are vulnerable. And so what you can do in terms of making sure that you don't have, we've got the OWASP top 10. Start putting some of these things into your build to make sure that you're protected. Security, much the same. One of the fitness functions that we often talk about is the notion that you might have a temporal fitness function. So, okay, you're using this framework and it's just been upgraded. I'm going to put you on a 90-day clock. And I'm going to keep checking, have you upgraded the framework yet? Yes or no? And the build still passes until day 91. And then you break the build. A big source of security holes are people not knowing that they haven't upgraded, or even potentially not knowing they're using a particular framework that has an exposure. These are simple things that we can put in. Reliability varies widely. The sandwich ordering system didn't need to be reliable. Rapid FTR, reliable took on a different kind of meaning because communication lines were often very unstable, and so it had to have a robust local reliability and offline functioning, but the overall system was never going to be reliable because the communication pathways were simply not stable. And so this is one of the conversations you have to have. How reliable does this system need to be? And how much is it going to cost to make it that reliable? And then loop back. Okay, given it's going to cost this much to be 5 nines, is 4 nines okay? I talked about observability before, but understanding how your system is actually working. And this becomes more complicated. If you've got a monolith, assuming it is not a complete, absolute ball of mud, you probably have a pretty good idea of what the data flows are through that monolith. If you've got 150 microservices talking to each other, it's a lot more difficult to get in your head how that system is behaving. So observability is very often this first-class citizen, because if you can keep a close eye on what your system is doing, you're in a better position to understand where it might have gone wrong. And of course, I have to mention testing, but having a robust test suite, having the discipline around continuous delivery puts you in a position where you can focus on the product that you're delivering, not the mechanism that deploys it. Fitness functions. I mean, come on. It's evolutionary architecture, right? But one of the things that we have found with fitness functions, it is a way to start the conversation about what is really necessary. What does our reliability have to be? This is something that we can measure. We've got a target for it. And there might be something squishier. Although it doesn't have anything to do with responsible tech, my personal favorite is maintainable. You can't measure that. So let's use fitness functions in conjunction with the build pipeline, running the test, so that we always know where are we against the standards that we've set for us with respect to responsible tech. And then, as I said before, it isn't just about diversity. It really isn't. It does help. But what helps as much as demographic diversity is diversity of thought. Do you have different perspectives in the room? And do you have the psychological safety, as Danielle talked about earlier, where people can say, wait a minute, that just doesn't work for me because X. Back to the William Gibson quote. We have to get past what is effectively the happy path from a functional perspective. We talk all about, oh, you've got the happy path, and now we've got all these error conditions that happen because of, things have timed out, or they've entered the wrong value, or all of those different things that happen. But there's also the not so happy path with respect to what happens when our creation is out in the world. How are people using this? And if we're not paying attention to that, then we're not doing our job. And the situation really has changed as more and more things come online. The state of Florida in the US has something called the Sunshine Law. And there are public records that have to be made public. I was a university professor there for a while. My salary was public. All kinds of records are public. What happened as government started to go online is all of these records that it used to be you had to walk to town hall to get access to are suddenly available on the internet. And there was one of those mashup apps that took all of this different data, and you typed in a name, and it came back with everything that the government knew about you. And they got my address right. A little concerning, but they got my address right. I was married to somebody I didn't even know. So there were all kinds of things that were both right and wrong. That wasn't a problem when all of those records were analog. Everything is digital now, and we need to recognize the fact that failure modes that couldn't have happened before can happen now. Here's another quote from Cathy O'Neill. We can make our technology more responsible if we believe that we can, and we insist that we do. And even more so than the previous quote, the we in that sentence is us. Thank you very much.